Hi everyone, this is Sarah with Safe Haven of Greater Waterbury. Today we're going to read a book called Tear Soup by Pat Schwiebert and Chuck DeKlyen, illustrated by Taylor Bills. This is a book about grief. The story is appropriate for children grades 3 through 6 and can also be helpful for older kids, teenagers, and even adults to read. We recommend parents watch this video by themselves first to decide if this video is appropriate for your child. Grief is the feeling of sadness over losing someone or something. Usually when we think about grief, we think about the loss of someone who's passed away. But we can feel grief about a lot of different things. The death of a loved one or pet, moving, changing schools, parents separating or divorcing, failing a class, losing a friendship, breaking up with someone that we're dating, or being diagnosed with a serious illness. We might also feel grief if something important to us breaks or gets lost or stolen. For example, if you had a special necklace that your grandma gave you and it broke, you might grieve the loss of that necklace because it reminded you of someone really important to you. We can also feel grief about losing opportunities that we might have had. Maybe you didn't make the basketball team this year, or maybe you weren't accepted to your first choice college. We want to talk about grief in this video because a lot of kids and adults are feeling grief right now during the COVID-19 crisis. Kids might be grieving not being able to go to school and see their friends or their teachers. Adults might be grieving too, perhaps the loss of a job, maybe losing the ability to go out when you want to, or not being able to see your friends or loved ones. We might be grieving the loss of someone who died because of the COVID-19 virus. Maybe you were supposed to go on a trip that got canceled because of travel restrictions. Right now, a lot of seniors in high school and college are grieving the loss of their senior year and all the special events that come with it. Senior day, prom, graduation parties. Whatever your reason for feeling grief, know that it's okay to feel the way that you're feeling, and that the way that you're feeling might change from day to day. There's no wrong or right way to feel grief. Let's get started with our story to learn a little bit more about grief and loss. Tear Soup. There was once an old and somewhat wise woman whom everyone called Grandy. She just suffered a big loss in her life. Pops, her husband, suffered the same loss, but in his own way. This is the story of how Grandy faced her loss by setting out to make tear soup. For many years, the custom of making tear soup had been forgotten. As people's lives became more rushed, they found it much easier to pull soup in a can from the shelf and heat it on the stove. But several years ago, Grandy got a taste of a well-seasoned tear soup. One of her friends made it from scratch after her child died. As soon as Grandy tasted the rich flavor of that carefully made soup, she promised herself never again to assume that quicker was better. Because of her great loss, Grandy knew this time her recipe for tear soup would call for a big pot. With a big pot, she would have plenty of room for all the memories, all the misgivings, all the feelings, and all the tears she needed to stew in the pot over time. And down here at the bottom, I just want to point out that there are pots for tear soup of all different sizes. There are really small ones for things that aren't fair, or maybe just bad news or disappointments, and very big ones for profound loss, major tragedies, and grief that feels like something more than you can bear. Sometimes when we feel grief over something, we might feel guilty because it seems like something that maybe isn't a big deal to other people. Sometimes when we're grieving, it feels like it's too much for us to take. Know that it's okay for you to grieve about a loss of any kind, no matter how big or small. She put on her apron because she knew it would get messy. It seems that grief is never clean. People feel misunderstood, Feelings get hurt, and wrong assumptions are made all over the place. To make matters worse, grief always takes longer to cook than anyone wants it to. And then, Grandy started to cry. At first she sobbed. Sometimes she wept quietly. And sometimes when she was in a safe place where no one could hear her, she wailed. Grandy knew she had to make much of this part of the soup alone. She learned from past experiences that most people don't like being around tears. Her friends would worry if they knew just how many tears Grandy's recipe called for this time. So the old and somewhat wise woman reflected on her own special recipe as she looked down into the large, overflowing pot of memories. It was a task she would repeat many times during the next few months. Sometimes, when we're grieving, other people might feel uncomfortable around us. It's important to remember that them being uncomfortable has more to do with them than it does you. They might have had experiences of loss in the past that are so difficult for them to face that being near someone else who is grieving is too much for them. Grandy winced when she took a sip of the broth. All she could taste was salt from her teardrops. It tasted bitter, but she knew that this was where she had to start. And for now, it was the only thing on her menu. There were things that Grandy never wanted to forget. These included the good times and the bad times, the silly times and the sad times. With her arms full of memories, Grandy made many trips to the kitchen. One at a time, she slowly stirred all her precious and not so precious memories into the pot. But eventually, she ran out of things to add. Grandy's arms ached, and she felt stone cold and empty. There were no words that could describe the pain she was feeling. What's more, when she looked out the window, it surprised her to see how the rest of the world was going on as usual, while her world had stopped. Sometimes when we experience a loss, it can feel confusing or even make us angry to see that the world keeps spinning, people keep on going about their lives, while we are sometimes feeling stuck in our grief or our loss. Her grandson, Chester, who just wanted his Grandy to be happy again, hoped his chocolate drops would make her feel better. Mrs. Blomklotz, Miss Chadwick, and Mr. Long, all brave yet fearful neighbors, dropped by to see how Grandy was doing. They filled the air with words, but none of their words took the smell of tear soup away. Grandy was gracious because she knew how helpless her friends felt. They wanted to fix her, but they couldn't. All Grandy really needed from them at that moment was a knowing look and a warm hug. If you're someone who cares about a person who's grieving right now, you might feel totally helpless, like nothing you can say can fix things for them. And in some ways, that is true. There's usually not much we can say to fix the situation for that person who's grieving. Sometimes simply spending time with someone or letting them know that you care about them and that you're there for them can be all that that person needs to feel supported. There were also days when Grandy hungered for a thoughtful ear. Sometimes she would ask total strangers, "Care to join me in a bowl of tear soup?" Even some of Grandy's friends hurried past her house and pretended not to notice the aroma of tear soup coming through her open door. Grandy found that most people can tolerate only a cup of someone else's tear soup. The giant bowl, where Grandy could repeatedly share her sadness in great detail, was left for a few willing friends. As we talked about earlier, a lot of people have a difficult time talking about grief and sadness, especially talking about somebody else's grief and sadness. Unfortunately, that can make the people who are grieving feel even more alone because it feels like no one wants to listen to them. "I'm here," Midge cried. "I got here as fast as I could, and I'll be here whenever you need me." What a tragedy. "I'm so sorry you're having to make such a big pot of soup." Oh, what a relief. Grandy knew she didn't have to be careful what she said around Midge. Midge wouldn't try to talk her out of anything she was feeling, and Grandy could even laugh and not worry that Midge would assume Grandy was over her grief. "Sorry I couldn't get here sooner," said Midge. "No problem," replied Grandy. "I've had plenty of help, but most of these friends will be history pretty soon. They'll be over my tragedy long before I am, but I know you'll still be around." It's wonderful to have friends and family who care about us and who will be there for us even during really difficult, challenging, terrible times, like when we've experienced a tragedy and when we're grieving. "I don't know what to say, but I'll be glad to listen," Midge said tenderly. "Come on, tell me all about it while we make some bread to go along with your soup." These two friends, who had shared 1,000 laughs and just as many tears, pounded at the bread dough together. "I feel like I'm unraveling," Grandy cried. "I'm mad. I'm confused. I can't make any decisions. Nobody can make me feel good. I'm a mess. I just didn't realize it would be this hard." "Why don't we go for a walk while we wait for the bread to rise?" Midge suggested. If you're feeling grief, you might feel a whole lot of different emotions, and that's okay. Sometimes we might feel guilty if we experience a moment of happiness right after someone has died. Sometimes we might feel guilty if we're still feeling sad or angry when other people seem to have moved on. Know that whatever way you're feeling is okay. "I know exercise is supposed to help me, but I feel like I have concrete blocks strapped to my legs. We'd better not go too far, or you'll have to carry me home," moaned Grandy. Mrs. Cries-a-Lot called and reminded Grandy that she had been making tear soup for years and would be more than glad to come right over and show her how to make it the correct way. "Thanks, but no," said Grandy. "This pot has my name on it." Grandy knew better than to let Mrs. Cries-a-Lot, or anyone else, tell her what she should be doing to get through this terrible loss. People experience grief in all different ways, and even people who are grieving because of the same reason experience grief differently. The way that you're feeling your grief is okay, and you don't need to make adjustments or change it for anyone else. Next, her recipe called for some comfort food. For Grandy, this meant mashed potatoes or ice cream. Comfort food always makes you feel better, at least for a little while. It gets past that big lump in your throat when other foods can't. "I think I need some chocolate too." After all, it was her soup. Can you think of any comfort foods that might help you feel better when you're feeling down? Sometimes giving ourselves a little treat when we're upset can help us feel a sense of comfort or peace for the time being. Grandy kept attending worship, even though she was mad at God. Sometimes she yelled at God and asked why this happened, and sometimes she demanded to know where God was when she was feeling so all alone. Still, Grandy trusted God, but she didn't understand God. She sensed that people believed that if she really had faith, she would be spared deep sorrow, anger, and loneliness. Grandy kept reminding herself to be grateful for all the emotions that God had given her. If you are a person who has a faith that they follow, we recommend that if you're grieving, speak to your faith leader about some of the different emotions or questions you might be having right now regarding your faith in the grieving process. On some afternoons, people would ask questions like, "Is it soup yet?" Or, "How long is it going to take? You've been at this for over a month now. It's time to get out of the kitchen." Grandy fumed at the caller's advice. Grandy looked forward to getting mail each day. She dreaded the day when no more sympathy cards would come. Sometimes other people, without meaning to, can make us feel like we should be over the thing that we're grieving about. Or maybe even that we haven't grieved long enough. And sometimes something that can be a scary feeling is feeling like other people have forgotten it or moved on when you're still feeling it. When she was alone and needed to think, she found it helpful to keep notes on her soup making. Sometimes writing in a journal can be a really good way to express the way we're feeling or just write down our emotions. Especially if we know no one else is going to read it, it might feel like a safer place to talk about the grief that we're feeling. Thank goodness Grandy and Pops had been married a long time. They already knew each other's tear soup would be different. Secretly, Grandy wished Pops would put more flavoring in his soup, but he doesn't want to, and he's perfectly content to dine alone and sip his own soup. We all grieve differently, and it's important to be respectful of the way that other people are grieving, even if it's not the way that you would grieve. Making tear soup is hard work. Sometimes it was all she could think about. Even the things Grandy used to love to do, she didn't have the energy for, nor did she care about anymore. Sometimes when we're feeling extremely sad, depressed, or grieving, we might lose interest in things that we used to enjoy. We might feel guilty about not doing those things. But it's okay to take time to feel the grief that you're feeling. Some of Grandy's friends over the years had not tended to their tear soup. Their soup boiled over and the pot scorched. What a mess. It took them a long time to clean up their pots and to start over. The smell of burnt soup still lingers in some of their homes. Even though grief can be really difficult and uncomfortable to deal with, it's important that we try to work through it. When we don't acknowledge our grief or we don't work on it, it can stew and it can become pretty messy. Grandy knew there were times when she needed to take a break from her soup making. Even though it was hard to do, she forced herself to get away. And that's something that's really important to remember. Even when we're grieving, even when we've suffered an extreme loss, sometimes we just need a break from it. It's okay to still do the things that you enjoy doing if you feel like doing them. Grandy heard that a neighbor was having to take her turn in the kitchen. Some people thought that the neighbor was eating too much tear soup. So Grandy, being an old and somewhat wise woman, called and invited her to a special soup gathering where it's not bad manners to cry in your soup or have second helpings. Soon the thoughtful cook sat at Grandy's table and discussed the process of making tear soup. There are some parts that require help from friends, and some parts that you just have to do alone. They shared stories about soup making they wouldn't dare tell anyone else for fear of being judged a bad cook. They all laughed knowingly when Grandy remarked how on days when she was daydreaming while driving, she was glad that the car seemed to know where she wanted to go. These people had become Grandy's new best friends. If you're experiencing grief, sometimes it can be helpful to join a support group. There are support groups for all different kinds of grief. People who have lost a loved one, like a spouse or child. People who have experienced a tragedy, like the 9/11 attacks. There are all kinds of support groups available. And sometimes it can be helpful to connect with people who have had similar experiences that you have. One day, as Grandy and Chester were going for a drive, Chester asked, "Mom says you've been making tear soup. What does that mean?" Well, tear soup is a way for you to sort through all the different types of feelings and memories you have when you lose someone or something special. Remember when your baby brother died right before he was born, and your mom sat for days holding his blanket and weeping? She was making tear soup. You made tear soup yourself by acting out your own disappointment when you shouted at Jason, wishing his brother would die too. Remember when Billy's dog died and he didn't want to play with you? Not feeling like having fun is one of the ingredients of tear soup also. And remember when Aunt May got divorced and they had to move? There was a lot of tear soup simmering in that house. Some days when you're making tear soup, it's even hard to breathe. Some days you feel like running away. You just hope a better day comes along soon. And then comes one of the hardest parts of making tear soup. It's when you decide it may be okay to eat something else instead of soup all the time. The next morning, as Grandy was cleaning up, Chester asked her if she was done making tear soup. "Well, I don't think you actually ever finish. The hard work of making this batch of soup is almost done, though. I'll put the rest in the freezer, and we'll pull it out from time to have a little taste." So what else have you learned by making tear soup, Grandy? I've learned that grief, like a pot of soup, changes the longer it simmers and the more things you put into it. I've learned that sometimes people say unkind things, but they really don't mean to hurt you. And most importantly, I've learned that there is something down deep within all of us ready to help us survive the things we think we can't survive. Grandy, you know so much. What will I do after you die? Don't worry. I'll leave you my recipe for tear soup. If you're grieving right now and you need support, please know that there are lots of organizations available that can help. We'll put some of these organizations in our description for the video with phone numbers to contact for grief support. Thank you for joining us today, and please check back soon for more videos from Safe Haven.